At Christ Community, we believe we are designed to give ourselves away for our neighborhood, city, and world. That part of what it means to be followers of Jesus, part of what it means to be a church, is to be self-giving. And Tim and Tom, today we get a chance to embark these next 6 weeks on a journey through one of our core values that really talks a lot about this, our value of the city. And we've done this with our other values: cross, yoke, Bible, church, and now city. What I'm really looking forward to in this series together is that we'll have an opportunity to hear from a variety of members of our congregation, people across our city who are living this out in all kinds of ways. But today we want to begin with sort of laying some of the groundwork. And Tom, you were here from the beginning, and I know that from the very beginning, Christ Community has a heart for our city. So what do we mean by city, and why is it so important?
Yeah, from the very beginning, we did have a heart for the city, and we looked at the city through two lenses, one a theological lens and one a sociological one. I mean, we're a church, we should be about theology. So when we look at the Bible, from the very beginning, we start in a garden, but the Bible story moves all the way to a city, right? The new heavens and new earth, and right in the heart of that is a new city called the city of Jerusalem, the new city of Jerusalem. And so what we see in the story of the Bible is this progression from a garden to a city. That's why cities matter so much. But they also matter because sociologically, that's how we're wired. I mean, as humans, we are part of a community, and we gather together in community around common economic interests, cultural interests, right? And sociological kind of realities, and a culture that we create. And so sociology matters when we think about cities because we identify with our city, right? When I first started Christ Community, I didn't go specifically to the mayor of Overland Park or Leawood. I went to the Mid-America Regional Council for looking at the whole metro region, because we are a metro region. And we think that way. When I travel, when you guys travel, you don't say, I'm from Olathe, I say, I'm from Kansas City, right? We identify with our city. But also just not too long ago, we all were Royals fans, right? It didn't matter if you were downtown or a suburb or wherever we were all Kansas City fans because the Royals won the World Series. I know you and your family were actually there in the city, and it was just packed with people. So the point is we simply identify with our city, and we're a part of that city. And how exciting it is when we were one church in one location, now we're one church in multiple locations all around the city, that we truly are in our multi-site mission, a church for the city.
Yeah, and it's fun to see that development kind of over the last 30 years as a church into how we think about the city now. And obviously we'll be going through the next few weeks how we think about engaging the city. But in terms of like broad framework, there's kind of three ways I think about our engagement of the city. The first probably is that our multi-site model, right? So Leawood, starts and is one church for the whole region, and now we're one church for the whole region, but we're in many different parts in our city. So our multi-site model is so much of how we think about engaging the city through neighborhoods, parishes, broadened out to the whole metro regional city. But then secondly, it's partnerships also, right? It's we want to find the best work being done in the city to address different issues within our city, and rather than try to always kind of reinvent the wheel as a church, partner with those key organizations that are doing great work. And kind of even how the multi-site and partnership comes together is I think about Advice and Aid, which is a partner that's been a part of Christ Community for a long time. And when we came online in Shawnee, we took up that partnership because we're a stone's throw away from where Advice and Aid is in Shawnee. And just seeing that partnership develop, that not too long ago they hosted a spa night where we were able to pour into those moms and those families just to encourage them. And so that partnership is like it's a totally different level because we're there, proximity. I also think of our partnership through the apartment complexes that we work with, Axiom Properties, that business, which again kind of came from our Leawood campus. And so, when we think about engaging the city, it's our multi-site model, it's our partnerships, our kind of key ways. I know the third way is city and our vocation, work and vocation.
Yeah, well, and that's so true, and that is something I never would have thought of as I was in seminary, and it wasn't really until I got to Christ Community where I began to think through that third way that we get to impact our city is through the work of our people and the places around the city. And so whether it's paid or unpaid, at home, school, work, just even think about the fact that the primary work, or one of the primary works of the church, is the church at work. And so, imagine with me, like every Monday, across Kansas City, through Christ Community, we have more than 3,000 people people spread out in those places, serving God and loving their neighbor. And in a globalized world, that reaches far beyond even just our own neighborhoods.
That's amazing when you think about it.
It is, and that's why we've talked more about being a church for Monday. That our job as pastors, our job as a church, is less about what we do on Sunday. Sunday matters, but it's so much more about equipping our people and ourselves to be ready for Monday. And I know Jeremiah 29 has been a big part of that thinking. Right. Tom, would you take us there?
Yeah, what a wonderful text it is, because God's people are in exile in a city of Babylon. They didn't really want to be there, but God's word to them is really profound and to us. I want to read it because it's such a great text, but this is what God's word says. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now listen to what he says. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare.
Tim, how does that passage help us?
Well, there's a lot there. Right, we've talked a lot about this passage, and we'll continue to talk a lot about this passage. But I think about Jeremiah 29, kind of two commands there that jump out to me. The first is that Jeremiah, or God through the prophet Jeremiah, says, multiply there, don't decrease. Which obviously involves having kids, planning how, all that's important, but it means far much more than that, because Babylon had a very intentional design to kind of stamp out the people that they brought into the exile. And so I talked more about that in the chapter, but Babylon would very intentionally try to strip you of your religious identity, your cultural identity, and God's saying, don't do that, right? Multiply there, don't decrease. And the 4th century Christian writer Augustine's kind of helped me think this out more in our own day, because Kansas City is different than Babylon. And what Augustine would say is that within every city there's two cities. There's city of God, city of man. The city of man is built on love of self at the expense of the love of God, and the city of God's built on love of God at the expense of love of self. And so every city, there's two cities, right? There's a city that's about love of self and individualism and self-desire, and there's a city that's built on the love of God, which is supposed to be the church. And so when God says multiply there, don't decrease, I think we need to recognize within every city there's this pull, this desire to pull us into love of self, self-centered desire instead of love of God, and we have to resist that desire to decrease our presence or our Christian distinctives. And this can mean a lot of different things, but one of the things it means just for me is one of the ways the city encourages me in love of self is my Netflix queue. Or that often what prevents me from loving my neighbor, being engaged in the work of the city, is I could watch everything on Netflix for the rest of my life and still probably get through like half of what's actually on there. And so there's, that's just this small pull towards, right, entertain yourself, love yourself, put yourself first. And as a Christian, I need to don't decrease, multiply, keep my distinctive love of God. And sometimes it's just it's just the Netflix queue that prevents that. And yet also, I think as we enter into our work and vocation life, also we need to be distinctively Christian in our work and vocation life as well.
Yeah, loving God and loving our neighbor so profoundly intersects with what we do every day in our vocation. When I think of that, I think of one of the members of Christ Community who's been around with us for quite a while. His name's David Greisel. If you know David Greisel, since he was this high, he knew God had called him to love God and love his neighbor by being an architect. And one of my favorite workplace visits, that's one thing that we do as a staff at Christ Community, is do workplace visits. One of my favorite ones was going to Pittsburgh to be with David Greisel, who designed, I think, the most beautiful baseball park in the United States called PNC Park in Pittsburgh. And David built a space for not only baseball and celebration that fits into the city. In fact, he spent a whole week walking and talking to people so that he could create a living space that fit the culture of that city. And one of the great things I love when you hear him talk about his design with the leaders of Pittsburgh is how he designed that stadium with them in mind for their whole city. And not only to flourish, but one of the great moments was he talked about generational memories happening in the stadium that he designed. How wonderful that David is used by God to love God and love his neighbor and create shalom in the city of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, that's great. So Tim, you said 2 commands. So multiply, don't decrease. So that's a call to distinction that we ought to do our work, live our lives in a different, a distinct way. What's the second command?
Yeah, second is to seek the welfare, seek the shalom of the city. And here's where I got to punt to Tom, because Tom's been thinking about shalom since I've been in diapers. And so Tom, tell us, what does that mean?
I don't know about that, but yeah, shalom is a really important word in the Bible. And of course, it's a center word in this text in Jeremiah 29. I read it and it's translated welfare, but it's the Hebrew word shalom. And shalom is this comprehensive idea of God's desire and delight in human flourishing in all dimensions, from the environment to our relationships to beauty. All that means to be human in God's image and the fullness of joy and delight. So it's a comprehensive idea of God's desire and design for human flourishing. And that is something God desires and that we are desire. Apostle Paul says we are good to all, that is to seek their flourishing, especially the household of faith, which is the church. And so shalom touches the economic life, it touches the social life, relational well-being with God and with others, and it deals with justice. One of the things I love most is when Andy Crouch came here. He's a remarkable teacher and leader, and he talked about the common good. He said one of the things, this is amazing, one of the ways you can tell if your city is truly flourishing, if it's experiencing shalom, if Kansas City would experience shalom, is the most vulnerable flourish. And of course, that takes us out of Sunday, as important as Sunday is, that takes us to our Monday world, on mission, on vocation, with God, and seeking the shalom of our city.
Yeah, I wanted to put just a story to all of those different dimensions. There's a congregant at Leawood, Steve Brown, who works for a company called Axiom Properties, that really lives out those different aspects of what shalom is. And so what they do is they take kind of decaying older apartment complexes that are more for the vulnerable of our city, and they make them beautiful. They make them meaningful. They give a good place to live. And so there's economic flourishing. It's a company that makes a profit and takes care of their investors, but it's also a place that creates a beautiful apartment complex to live in for people who are socioeconomically on the poor end of the spectrum. And then thirdly, the vulnerable, I think of Steve and the many people that work for him, and even one of the people that work for him, our church has been just in relationship with, and he said, he's like, I had come to this place where I didn't think there were people who loved others anymore, and then I met Steve, and Steve helped him get a job and has helped him in a place where he's in an economically vulnerable position, and it's just a great example, right? Economic flourishing, social flourishing, creating good places to live, and then keeping an eye on the vulnerable. That's what shalom means, and that's what we want to do as we engage the city on Monday.
Well, Tim, why don't you wrap us up? We want to do this. We want to give ourselves away for our city. We want to seek the shalom. What's one thing that we can do even now as we think about this?
Yeah, it's a classic pastor answer, which is go to church on Sunday, every Sunday.
So Sunday matters too.
Yeah, it does. And so I mentioned, the city of man has habits, rhythms, practices that encourage us into love of self, the Netflix queue, or the way our work or vocation may go about things. And what Sunday is, they're counterformation practices, habits, liturgies that form us into the way of God and make us living into love of neighbor, love of city, love of the kingdom first. And that's what we're doing through preaching the gospel, through singing together, taking communion together. And yet, as we mentioned, we have an obligation as pastors to create a Sunday service with Monday in mind, right? So Sunday's not an escape from Monday, it's a preparation for Monday. And so both of those pieces go together. And so, if when we lose that Sunday commitment, I think often we become more formed into the way of the city of man. And so, as simple as it sounds, go to church so that you're ready for Monday.